Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Lotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Sir. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Moreno, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, King, Lujan, Murkowski, Murphy, Padilla, Peters, Sanders, Warner, and Welch. Ms. Lotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Fetterman, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
The yeas are 51. The nays are 49. The confirmation is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. I recognize the senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much to my colleagues. We'll soon be starting what is commonly called a vote-a-rama. If you've never been in one, it's okay. But no, it's a chance to have a spirited discussion and debate about policy and about the budget resolution. So what's happened here is that the Budget Committee reported out Senate Concurrent Resolution 7 that will allow through the reconciliation process the spending of money and the reduction of spending based on different committees. This resolution allows for $175 billion of border and immigration policy enhancements, but it doesn't spend a penny. It allows the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee to come up with up to $175 billion plan to secure our border and do immigration reform. And what will happen is that those two committees, Mr. President, will work with the Trump administration to meet their priorities. There's nothing in this resolution directing one dime of spending, and no spending bill can be implemented without presidential signature. So I want to make sure that's clear. There's $150 billion in increased defense spending. Why? Because we have a lot of threats. Since the withdrawal of Afghanistan, radical Islam is on the rise. We've got a hot war with Russia and Ukraine. Israel's facing enemies on 7 sides. We've provided weapons to our allies in Ukraine and Israel. We've run out of 155 howitzer rounds for a while. We've got to reinforce our industrial base. We need more money into our military yesterday to make sure that we can deter war, and if we get them to a war, we win it. So the $150 billion will be allocated by the Armed Services Committee. We don't direct how the $150 billion is spent. We just allow the Armed Services Committee to spend that much if they choose. They decide what to spend it on. So this idea that there's somehow money in this resolution for Ukraine or any other specific purpose is not true. All we do is create a number for the committees to mark up to, and it's up to the committee as to what is in the $150 billion package. And to all the colleagues here, you'll eventually get to vote on that work product. And if you don't like it, you can vote no, and eventually that work product will have to be signed by the president. So that's the way the process works. But what we're doing today is jump-starting a process that will allow the Republican Party to meet President Trump's immigration agenda through the reconciliation process. And the Democrats used this very process to pass Obamacare and the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to use it to secure our border. We're not going to grow the government just for the sense of growing the government. We're not going to create the Green New Deal. We're going to create border security transformational in nature. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to embark on a plan to jumpstart the most transformational border security bill in the history of the United States, because we need it yesterday. We've had 11 million people come to this country legally. Fentanyl kills 3,000 Americans every 2 weeks. It comes across that southern border. We're running out of detention space to hold people. Tom Homan, the border czar, came to the Republican Senate last week or 2 weeks ago and said that ICE is out of money. This resolution jumpstarts the process to get Tom Homan the money he needs to fill the promises we made, to build more detention beds so you don't have to let people go. Laken Riley's murderer was in detention and released because of lack of bed space, wound up killing the young lady. That should never happen again. When you're detained, we should hold you and process you according to law, not release you. We need more detention beds. We need to finish the wall. This $175 billion will be allocated by the committees in question, and it will allow President Trump to finish the wall, secure the border, and deport criminals. ICE is out of money. If you think it's a good idea to go after the criminal gangs that have come here over the years illegally, then you're right. To my Democratic colleagues, you should be working with us, not against us. Everybody should want to clean up the mess of the last 4 years. Everybody should want to go after criminal gangs. Everybody should want to secure the border because it's a national security nightmare. And nobody should want the dilemma of a nation having to let somebody go who could potentially be dangerous because you have no place to put them. This $175 billion will allow the most transformational border security bill in the history of the country at a time of great need. The $150 billion will be allocated by the Armed Services Committee. They'll decide what to spend it on, but there's a lot of modernization we need of our nuclear triad fleet. We need more weapons. Our stockpile is low. There's a bunch of things we can spend $150 billion on, but we'll let the Armed Services Committee decide those priorities. When it comes to the border security $175 billion plan, the committees of jurisdiction will allocate that money, not this resolution. But without this resolution, we can't move forward. Why is this resolution important? Without this bill passing, Senate Concurrent Resolution 7, there is no hope of getting money for the border the way it needs to be done. Without this resolution passing tonight or early tomorrow, we're not going to get any money for the military without having to negotiate non-military spending increases. We don't have a lack of spending problem in our country. We have spent way too much on things that don't matter enough. Part of this process will be committees finding offsets, reducing spending. So we're telling the Armed Services Committee, spend $150 billion the way you see fit. We're telling 2 committees to spend $175 billion to secure our border, and we're telling 7 other committees, find savings inside your committee to offset the spending we're creating in this bill. I think they can do that. I think what DOGE is doing is good. This is a form of that. Every committee that's been instructed to save at least $1 billion will be able finally to go into the committee itself, what they spend on, and reduce spending because we're directing them to. My hope is that the $342 billion we're going to spend to secure our border, help the military, enhance the Coast Guard, will be offset with $342 billion of cuts in other parts of the government. We can do it, but this resolution has to pass or we won't do it. I'm highly confident that the Republican chairman of the committees in question will deliver. I'm highly confident that we can find savings in the government to offset the spending we're creating. The Democratic Party used this process for the Green New Deal. They used this process for Obamacare. We're using this process to help our military, who needs help, to secure a border that's been broken, and enhance the Coast Guard. That's the difference. We're doing things that need to be done to make us safe. 3,000 Americans die every 2 weeks because fentanyl comes across the border. We're going to fix that. Since President Trump's been in office, border crossings have gone down by 90%. We want to reinforce its success. We want to finish that wall. We want to make sure we never release another person in this country because we don't have a bed. We're going to make sure that the criminal gangs keep leaving, not staying, because the ICE doesn't have enough money. Why are we doing this? Because Tom Holman and Mr. Voigt, the head of OMB, told us 2 weeks ago we're out of money to finish the job that President Trump started. To my House colleagues, I prefer one big, beautiful bill that makes the tax cuts permanent, that does the things we need to do on the border and with our military and cuts spending. I wish you all the best. I prefer what you're doing to what we're doing, but we got to have a plan B if you can't get it done soon. What is the Senate doing? We've decided to front-end load security. We want to cut taxes. We want to make the tax cuts permanent. We're going to work with our House colleagues to do that. They expire at the end of the year, but we have time to do that. It is the view of the Republican Senate that when it comes to border security, we need not fail. We should have the money now to keep the momentum going. When it comes to the Republican Senate, we believe the military needs money now because the world's on fire. To my House colleagues, we will all get there together. If you can pass the one big, beautiful bill that makes the tax cuts permanent, not 4 or 5 years, then we'll all cheer over here. Nothing would please me more than Speaker Johnson being able to put together the bill that President Trump wants. I want that to happen, but I cannot sit on the sidelines and not have a plan B. This nation is under threat. The illegal immigrants who have come here by the millions need to be sent back by the millions. The border needs to be secured. The wall needs to be finished. We need more detention space. We need to upgrade our military capability now. The reason we're doing it now is because we were told ICE is out of money now. So I'm hoping that the House can deliver, but I am very confident that the Senate, early in the morning, Republicans, not one Democrat vote, will set in motion a process that will transform our border security to the most modern, aggressive border security plan in the history of the country, north and south, that will set in motion $175 billion of new spending to secure the border in a way that's never been achieved in the past. If this resolution fails, God help us all. If this resolution passes, help is on the way. If you believe that America needs to be serious about securing our border, this bill gets the job done. If you believe the military needs to be stronger, not weaker at a time of threat, this bill gets it done. If you believe the Coast Guard needs more capability to deal with drugs and national security threats, this bill delivers. This is a security bill. This is a bill that will combat fentanyl killing Americans. There are more Americans dying every 2 weeks from fentanyl than on 9/11. Hundreds of thousands of young Americans, young and old, but mostly young, have died from fentanyl poisoning coming across that southern border. We're going to go after those cartels. I'm confident that President Trump is the new sheriff in town that we need. But without resources, it won't work. Tom Holman came to us and begged us for money to continue the plan he's enacted to get gangs out of this country, to secure that border, to have more detention space. Tom, we heard you. We're going to meet your needs. So I'm excited about this debate. I'm excited about Republican-led committee chairman, finding ways to reduce spending to pay for this. This is a big deal, folks. The Republican Party is going to go all in on border security. We're going to upgrade our defense capability, and we're going to pay for it. Anybody at home ever had to pick between two things? You couldn't be everything, you couldn't have it all, that you had to spend because your child got sick or hurt, and you had to cut somewhere else because there wasn't enough money to do both. We're going to set priorities. If you have a sick child or something bad in your family happens, that goes first. That means you have to pinch somewhere else, except in Washington. Well, that model's over. We're going to start a new way of doing business.